Good evening, and welcome to Comix Experience Graphic Novel of the Month Club for this is the month of September.
Oh, sweet.
And our book is Come Again, here and there. We have two cameras. And our author is Nate Powell, who's here.
Hey, y'all.
This is where you... Thank you. That was the thing I was going to do earlier.
This is vaguely a new experience for
Yeah.
me. Is this where I am actually allowed to look straight into the camera?
Yes, look straight in the camera. Yeah, do it.
Like, hello, non-existent people who really exist somewhere else?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. There could be people watching us on the live stream, though.
Okay.
There usually isn't. I'm just saying, everybody goes live stream. What a great idea, and then no one watches it. It's the craziest thing. But we do it anyway because we love you that much.
And you can do that.
But yeah, no, people will be watching this kind of for the rest of time. So any answer that you give, make sure you understand that you're giving it for
archival.
the rest of time. Yeah, exactly. The book has come again, and Nate Powell's here, and I'm pretty excited. You have a very interesting career, and I think this will be an interesting talk. You've been, as I understand it, you've been making your own mini comics since you were 14. Is that right?
Yeah. Well, I started drawing comics when I was 12. And right when I turned 14, started self-publishing them.
Yeah.
So that was the beginning of 9th grade, 1992. And it was the peak of the comics boom of the early 90s.
Sure.
But my one local shop owner in North Little Rock, Arkansas, in the late 70s and early 80s, he did some self-publishing, so he had just enough of a soft spot that he gave my collaborator and I some very crucial shelf space.
Is this Michael Tierney?
Michael Tierney.
Yeah. Who did Wild Stars, right?
Yes.
Yeah. See, I'm old school. I know what I'm talking about.
I just saw him last week.
Yeah.
I do
Nice.
signings at his store still to this day.
Nice, super nice. He was buying the stuff outright from you?
No, we did a 60-40 consignment deal. And
60 to you, 60 to the store.
60 to me.
Very good.
Yeah.
All right. That's more generous than we do, kids.
And actually, I was photocopying the interiors for almost free, but we were spending $1 a piece to make color covers.
Right. Sure.
We're like, well, comics have color covers.
Sure.
So this is like pre-internet Arkansas with a drought of non-superhero books. So it was like, fine and dandy dystopian guns and boobs superhero comics. But yeah, literally the entire budget was to have a color cover, which I colored it with like markers.
Yeah.
And I was like, that's good. It's in color.
Yeah.
And then I was like, why don't we have any money to make more?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you were precocious enough at 12 to think that you could do it. That's amazing to me.
Well, a lot of that's like Little Rock. I was intertwined with the underground do-it-yourself punk scene at the same time that my friend Mike and I were part of a group of 6 or 8 other 2-bit cartoonists in Central Arkansas. So I feel like the DIY ethic really carried across every part of my life.
Nice.
And just knowing slightly older kids who had tapes or records of their band,
or
we put out zines. All of a sudden, that was immediately translatable to the comics we were doing. We're like, oh, right, you just print those too.
Sure. But even here, my memory was everybody was doing music and was doing zines, and zines about music mostly.
Sure.
It was all about music when you're a teenager. And so why comics? Why? What was it about comics that made you think this is the thing?
I'd say, I started reading comics at age 3 and never looked back. I started drawing at age 3, but I didn't put the two interests together actively until my friend Mike Lyerly, who was my strongest early collaborator and later bandmate and lifelong best friend. It took him, he had been drawing comics for like 2 years before me. He was the old dog. But I feel like it's important for me to communicate. He had to say the words, we should make comics together. And it was almost like a magical invocation. Once he said it, all of a sudden I was like, oh, yes, we should. And I just never, ever looked back. And before that, I had not thought that I could actually draw sequential comics instead of just drawing cool ninjas and wizards.
Sure.
That like verbalizing the intention changed everything.
Yeah. I can totally see that. Your early comics that you're doing, I mean, how many copies are you printing? How are you making that happen?
The first one was 105 copies.
Wow.
And all the early ones, the first couple, the superhero ones, were all 50 to 100 copies. And then and basically that was the office where my dad worked, had a copy machine, and there was a busted copy machine in the church that our families went to. And so each one of those, we would just photocopy them until the machine broke. Right. We would slowly like back out of the room. And then a few years later, let's say hypothetically that in the 90s, at particular photocopying corporations, there were a series, hypothetically, of scams that could be done to get hypothetically free copies.
Sure.
But along the way, because like hypothetically one couldn't get busted doing that.
Right.
So whether it was my dad's copy machine or the one at a hypothetical place, as a teenager I developed a second skill set that was photocopier repair.
Right.
And I got very good at troubleshooting and fixing photocopiers as like as a 10th grader. And it was just really weird to be like, I've got this shit inside and out. I can do it all. And so basically until the year 2000 it was all photocopies. But at a certain point, when my band started touring and the things got a little bit more distributed, even though the copies were still hypothetically free, I was spending so much time collating now 1,400 copies of a comic that I didn't have time to draw them, and I didn't know what to do next.
Yeah.
And it took until I got a self-publishing grant my last year of school that I could actually put money into having them offset printed.
Yeah. 1,400 copies. That's a ton of copies. That's when I think about people bringing me self-published books, I know they're selling 5 and 10 in each local store. Like print runs are 50 and 100, and wow, that you got it up to 1,500. That really kind of blows my mind. Is that something that's specific to the culture that was happening in Little Rock at the time, or?
Well, it's the way that Little Rock's. I mean, I would sell an okay amount in Arkansas at a couple of shops. Really, this has much more to do with Little Rock being one of the best cities in America for underground punk to happen in the 1990s. And so we became, thanks to folks a couple years older than me, we were woven into this network of young creative people, and through their bands touring and then our generation's bands touring, there was this sort of back and forth by which people at first would trade zines or records and trade ideas, and then would trade touring schedules. And then I started to do artwork and write columns for a punk zine out of California. That's this state. called Heart Attack. And really, like, it had to do with the expansion, and especially as I aged and was able to actually drive across the country and stuff. But all of this was in person, pretty much on site. There was also a local, there's an underground book and zine distribution company that happened to be out of Little Rock that started taking on, 50 or 100 copies of the books. Right.
You don't usually associate most cartoonists with being outgoing, being salespeople, right? I mean, because it's a solitary profession in a lot of ways, right? You're sitting at the drawing board, and is there something that you attribute that to?
I think even before I started playing shows in my band, like the few times I had to get up on stage for like a piano recital or to be in like a junior high play, I wasn't totally comfortable doing it, but I did not have stage fright. So by the first show my band ever played, that wasn't a problem. Right. And I think that helped. And also we wore outrageous costumes and did humiliating things and forced the audience to do funny and humiliating things. So like our entire thing was breaking down the artifice of coolness. Sure. And so I think once we got into a much more socially awkward subculture, like comics, I feel like that part of me was predisposed to to just not have time for the kinds of anxiety. Like, I had different anxieties in my life.
Sure, I get it.
That, like, I kind of squashed that.
Yeah.
And I could spend my other time freaking out about other things.
Yeah. You said 3 was the first comic. What's the first comic you remember reading?
Well, the first comic I read was chronologically. Like, the ones that I dug through was the first appearance of Rocket Raccoon. It was Incredible Hulk 280.
Wow. What an incredibly random comic
Because I still have it.
Sure, yeah.
But the first comic I was into, like, it was thanks to Wonder Woman, Spider-Man, and the Hulk being on TV at the same time.
Yeah, sure.
That's how I got into comics.
Yeah.
But it was the Wonder Woman run that Dan Mishkin and Gene Colan did in the early 80s. That was my first comics run. And so I still have those issues. And it's really wild. Like, I did a little talk at Michigan State a few years ago, just gave a little slideshow, like, here's some comics. And I started off talking about Wonder Woman and these weird pages that intrigued me as a 3-year-old, and then my crude drawings of Wonder Woman as a 3-year-old. And it turns out that Dan Mishkin, the writer, was in the audience. He was like, I wrote all those books.
That's funny. Wow.
And now we're buddies.
Wow, that's super cool. Wow. Were your parents buying you these comics? Were you buying them yourself off the newsstand, or did you buy them from the comic shop?
I started buying my own comics when I was probably 6. Once I started getting, like, $3 a week for cleaning my room or whatever. Yeah. Obviously it's a balancing act. Do you buy,
candy?
Do you buy candy, or do you buy, like, a weird Voltron thing that's going to break, or do you buy some comics?
Yeah.
But quickly the balance started tipping towards comics.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Wow, that's neat. It's interesting because we talk about the newsstand, things like that, but it's actually kind of rare that you get people who are buying comics as a kid.
Sure.
All the way. Like, it's usually the parents are bringing them in and going, hey, comics,
Yeah, well, my parents very quickly kicked down their leftover collections.
Oh, nice.
My dad got most of his thrown out, but my mom had a good amount of just 1950s comics that she gave me. It was mostly, like, Little Lulu and Shaggy Dog Detective. But pretty quick, they encouraged me to actually go to the comic book store, though.
That's amazing,
And the first store I went to was inside an independent bookstore.
Right.
It sounds cooler than it is.
Yeah.
It was in Alabama, so it's like, it was the bookstore.
Right.
But they actually, when I look back, or when I think back, the bookstore owners spent time. They had back issue sections.
Sure.
When I was like 8 years old, I started reading merchandised, still kind of underground Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, and I was like, "What is this?" Like, it's in black and white. It literally looks dirty. Like, I couldn't understand what the comic was. And I remember Scott McCloud put out a book when I was 8 called Destroy.
Yeah.
Which I recently finally got on eBay. But it was like the thing that when I spotted it in the rack as an 8-year-old. I was like, what is this? And then it says, like, asshole during a double-page spread. And I was like, what? I was like, you can say bad words in comics? But then I was like, I was like, so, like, as a 38-year-old, at a certain point, I was like, I'm gonna buy that goddamn Destroy comic.
So you went to school at some point for?
I did go to school.
No, for comics. Yes. Specifically for drawing, for illustration.
Yes.
A general college at first?
No, well, I went to 1 year of school at a regular college, mostly because
general college.
Yes. At a standard college, see? Basically, I was a, quote, good student in high school, but I did not ever think about college.
Right.
And so basically it was, like, too late for me to like, sort out my life and realize what I wanted to do with my life. So I had I'd already, like, signed up. I had just enough scholarship money and loans and stuff that I could go to a year of some college, but I had a very emotional experience listening to the Bruce Springsteen live box set, in which I realized that I always knew that I needed to draw comics, and that was the thing I needed to pursue, and that was my, like, stereotypical like, Mom, Dad, you can't keep me down moment.
Right.
And I had to like write them a thing where I was like, I'm gonna go to School of Visual Arts.
Right.
I'm gonna be a comic book artist.
Right.
And that's what I did.
How long SVA? I want to say, like, from what I think of your age, was just starting their comics program around that time.
Oh no,
right? No.
In fact, I don't know it exactly, but I know they had the very first cartooning major in the country. But I also know that at the latest in the 60s, they had cartooning majors because co-founder of Punk Magazine, John Holmstrom, was a student of Harvey Kurtzman's and Will Eisner's in the cartooning department there.
Okay.
And that would have been, well, the early 70s. But I think when they started in 47, they had a, like, they were oddly...
But like a newspaper cartooning,
sure.
rather than comics as we understand, because they're different things, right?
Yeah.
Functionally, right? Like structurally, they're very different things.
Yes.
You know? Yeah. You're in this really curious place where, as a young kid, you're making money off comics. I'm really impressed by this. I'm sorry to keep going back to it, but when I think about a lot of people's careers, they go into comics and like for years they still don't make money, even working like at Marvel and DC, right? And you just were doing your own stuff and making comics and...
Right, but still, like, the money that I was making, because I was trying to figure out how to get out of the trap of actually producing the comics, all of the money was still going into making more comics.
Yes.
So it was becoming a sustainable thing, except for the time and labor.
Yeah.
But it still wasn't leaving the eternal cycle.
Understood.
I wasn't buying a sandwich out of it.
Understood. Understood. And in fact, my understanding is that like from '99 to 2009, something like that, you were working with developmentally disabled people.
Yeah, that was my career for a decade, and really it wasn't until 4 years ago that I became pretty sure that I could keep doing full-time cartooning. So for like the first 5 years of being a full-time cartoonist, every 3 months I would crunch numbers and like just make sure that if I needed to call my old employer up, that I could potentially get my job back. And you know, the joy of that is that it was work that I valued and still value, and I was good at it. So, like, I don't know. If that were to go down, I really wouldn't feel deflated about it at all. Like, there's a lot of me that actually misses that. I think once my kids get older and I start to get a little bit more free time, I'll probably re-enter the workforce without much regard for making money doing the work, but maybe putting in 10 or 15 hours a week doing care and advocacy.
Yeah, nice. That's interesting. Yeah. When so you're doing this for 10 years and you're making comics. So you're making comics at night, on the weekends, in your free time. How did you make that break? Right, because you described it as a trap, which I think is really accurate, you know, because as a young creative person you want...
Certainly. Well, it's like, part of it is like as a young person, you don't see the things that you're doing wrong that are preventing you from getting where you think you want to go.
Sure.
So, like, I had a bunch of friends who were, my classmates at SVA, and they were like taking Marvel and DC and Nickelodeon internships.
Right.
They stayed in New York City over the summer. I was going home everything was revolved around my band. So my class assignments were things that I wanted to do already for my comics and zines, and I was like booking tours on the phone while doing my homework, and then the second school would get out, I would go back to Arkansas and get ready to tour or record. So it took until that band played itself out and was no longer a sustainable thing that I realized I had been organizing my entire life around the schedule of that band. So as soon as the band became defunct in 2006, all of a sudden I was like, oh, I do have the time to make a 200-page book, which would swallow me whole, instead of just always making 30 or 50-page stories. But then by that point, like all the way up to 2008, I had completely given up on the possibility of being able to make a living off of comics, and that was fine. Like I was doing my thing, and that was fine. But Jim and Mark, from the writers of The Silence of Our Friends, cold called me somehow one day in the fall of 2008, wanting to know if I could draw The Silence of Our Friends.
Right.
And they said they had the script and all this stuff. But because I had already, this is where the box that you put yourself in changes the way that you're receiving information. Because I had already figured out that I couldn't make a living off comics.
Yes.
I was like, but I'm not, I said I couldn't, I turned them down actually.
Right.
I was like, but it takes me years to make my own stuff.
Right.
If I work on this, I won't be able to do my own. I've got this full-time job.
Right.
And then one time, there was, like a conscious voice in the back of my head that was like, this is the time to quit your job.
Right.
And just see if it works.
Right.
For 3 or 6 months.
Right.
So I started the exit plan. And
they were offering a page rate to do Silence of Friends, yeah?
Well, yeah, that's the thing. Like, it had not even crossed my mind that I could get some kind of an advance payment that I could potentially live off of.
Okay.
Like, even 5 or 6 years before that,
Sure.
Sam Keith cold called me, a world of cold calls, wanting to know if I would draw 2 different books of his that he had been writing. And I met with him, and I made some sketches. We'd have these long, great phone conversations.
Sam's a great guy.
Yeah, a very kind dude.
Yeah, he's
very thoughtful.
Yes, yeah.
But that was like 2002, 2003, and it never even occurred to me that somebody would pay me money in advance of making the book.
Sure.
So I was like, there's just no way I can do that. I had to turn it down flat out.
Sure. Well, this is the downside of the DIY experience, right?
Right.
Like that. It's do it yourself. It's not. They don't involve other people. It's
to this day, it's really nice that, especially friends of mine who are more squarely millennial cartoonist friends, have a very different and I think more self-respecting mindset about don't do X if you're not going to get paid.
Yeah.
Don't do blankety blank if there's not some kind of agreement beforehand.
Sure.
Things that I think generally did not, they weren't givens with my cross section of cartoonists, or maybe it's just me. But it's been nice to kind of pay attention to my millennial cartoonist friends. To be like, oh right, you can ask for that.
Yeah.
You can expect that.
Sure.
But to think back at the times where that never even crossed my mind. I'm like, I just turned down not 1 but 2 books with the creator of the Max. Okay, that's cool. I'll get over that someday.
You were doing Swallow Me Whole at the time that Silence was offered to you, or had it been completed at that point?
It had just been published.
Okay, just been published.
Yeah.
Okay, great.
So that was actually the thing where Jim and Mark saw it. I think at Ape here actually.
Yeah.
And they called me the next week.
Yeah. And what was it like doing a 200-page book? Because, as you said, at that point you had only done 30, 50 pages at a time.
Well, basically, when I started Swallow Me Whole, I dreamed it up in 2001. I was ready to draw it in 2004, but I was assuming I would self-publish it.
Yeah.
So I was like, I'll make it 4 50-page issues, or
Right.
48-page issues. So I just I sat down and in a week I drew the first 20 pages, penciled, inked, lettered. It was completely done. And I used that, and I guess I had bombed at an attempt to pitch it to Vertigo.
Right.
And actually, it was entirely my fault. Shelley Bond emailed me to be like, if you have a book idea, pitch it to me. And then I was just like, I don't know how to do this. So.
Right.
But yeah, I sent that to Top Shelf, who I'd already been pen pals with for a while. And basically, Chris Staros was like, we want to do this. Basically, because you're not as good of a writer as you are an artist, stop inking your pages.
Right.
We want you to pencil the whole book and, letter in your writing or write a script or whatever, and then we'll hash out the problems and go through the editing, and once it's done you can just burn through the inks. And I've actually been using that method ever since, and it works well, and it works well with the Top Shelf gang. It's also helped me in my growth, so that I'm slightly better of a writer than 15 years ago. That having that expectation and waiting for a certain kind of feedback that I know is going to change my story.
Did you re-pencil the stuff that had already been inked up to that point, or was it just like from page 40 on?
Yeah, that pretty much stayed. So
Okay.
the first 20 pages were in 2004, and the rest of the book was inked in 2007.
Interesting. Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. That's a pretty fascinating way to work.
It's weird. Also, the first 20 pages have no nib pen. It's all brush, like 100% of it. And then when I hit it again, I was like, oh, well, why am I doing that?
Sure.
So.
Yeah. Top Shelf then became your home, like the next 4 or 5 projects that you've done. What do you think that they bring to comics that other publishers don't?
Well, on a more practical end, I mean, granted, Top Shelf is owned by IDW now, but in speaking of it in a general and long-ranging sense, Top Shelf is a fully independent, like mid-level indie company, like Fantagraphics and D&Q, and they all have a diminished capacity to pay you in advance, some advance money, but if you can find a way to finish your book without needing the advance money, they have as good or better of a skill set and potential to get your book out there than a more book industry linked company that can pay you more money. That's kind of the trade-off. But basically, if I didn't have 2 kids, this wouldn't even be a consideration in my mind. But the older I get, my entire Top Shelf generation, many of them are now parents and have had to make more practical decisions, which have resulted in them not being able to play that game anymore. I lucked out because right as I became a parent, I started work on March. And because we had no idea what the potential scope or scale of March was, but knowing it was going to be bigger, Top Shelf was like, look, we will pay you a page rate as an advance. So that you can do this, and that is the thing you do. And that really, that helped all of it happen. It helped smooth over the anxiety of now having, a small child and making weird comics. And that bet really paid off really well, right? It was very transformative.
That's
life-changing.
Pretty transformative. I just want to ask 1 or 2 more questions about Top Shelf and working with them. I mean, the thing that I've heard from a lot of people is that working with Chris makes your comic better at the end of the day, right? Because his suggestions are he gets it, right? He actually gets comics.
So I guess in talking about Chris and in talking about Lee, also as a main editor in Top Shelf, and also essentially my brother from another mother. Lee is a very detail-oriented person, and he and I have very similar deep interests in particular rabbit holes, and we both want to entertain each other going down certain rabbit holes, and so when the 2 of them are looking at something that I make at the same time, Chris is really good at seeing the big picture, at seeing larger themes and connections, and then both of them also function in terms of knowing you and caring about you and pulling things out of you that they can see emerging in the book and not being afraid to ask you about them or talk about them. But Chris, he's he's a very patient, temperate dude, and so for each of the 3 full-length books, it would be a series of probably 5 or 6 different drafts of pencils. And we would go through long phone conversations and email chains where he would ask specific questions, and we would work out a full edit. I would redraw dozens of pages, send a whole new thing, and then bit by bit, draft by draft, it's working itself out. But this is the kind of thing that when I first pitched Swallow Me Whole to Vertigo, Shelley Bond really helped set up my lifelong relationship with editors in a very simple way. She was like, look, I know how you indie cartoonists are. Basically, I don't want like, I don't want to tell you, like, I'm going to change your book, but I'm going to change your book. And at the point, you need to know the point at which you are not comfortable with that. So know where that level is, know when you feel it, so that we're not wasting each other's time. And then we wound up not working together, but it made me mentally prepared for the fact that you're working with an editor specifically to change your book. It's not an oppositional relationship. You want them to change your book because you don't know everything.
How often have you reached that point?
Not really. There are a couple of times where there's something maybe I'm not communicating clearly, so that Chris or Lee are missing a really fundamental basic thing that'll tie into even the book title or the setting, something super basic. But what that says to me is it reveals that I need to figure out a way to communicate something that's obviously very important to me in a more clear way.
I got you.
And so I've never actually gotten there.
Okay. And when you say pencils, do you mean like literally full pencils, or are we talking thumbnails?
No, my pencils are very rough. So usually I'll pencil a page in 20 minutes.
Oh, nice. Okay.
And I spend at least 80% of my time on the inks. But I feel it's hard to say this without tooting my horn. I feel really at home inking. I feel very confident doing it. I just listen to music and I enjoy myself and I love putting ink on paper. So I'm not actually thinking much, but essentially I'm thinking with the ink. So I just try to make my pencils legible enough so that an editor can see what's happening. And with March I had to make them a little bit tighter in order to communicate certain information on an editorial level, but not that much more clear.
Top Shelf came to you with March, is that right?
Yes. Well, first, Andrew and Congressman Lewis got a publishing deal with Top Shelf with no artist. And I remember reading the press release and be like, oh, what a cool project. Awesome. But I was busy, so I was back to work, doing Silence of Our Friends and Any Empire. And then a week or two later, Staros called me. I was like, I don't know if you saw our press release, but I strongly suggest you try out for the role for X, Y, and Z reason. But beyond that, then he just gave me Andrew's email address, and it was exactly like deciding to collaborate with anybody else, except it just happened to be with John Lewis.
Was there a script already done at that point?
The two of them spent about 2 years making a basic working script for March, a single volume graphic novel that was going to be 270 pages. So I got that after I did my demo pages, and within 48 hours of reading that script, I emailed everybody back. It was like, great book idea, again, just letting you know it's going to be 600 pages.
Right.
So if you're cool with that, then just let me do my thing. And so that was always the plan, was to have it be a big brick of a book. And then at Comic Con in 2012, Andrew and I finally met in person for the first time. And basically we were like, well, just to take the pressure off, let's break it up at its natural chapter points and just make it 3 books. Not realizing that blew open the doors of possibility for March in terms of readability for younger people, people to grow into it, the ability to comment on the world, and the situation on the ground through the books. We didn't that changed the entire legacy and arc of March. Just the decision to make it a manageable seeming project and take the pressure off.
I mean, you caught lightning in a bottle there. At what point did you realize that you had caught lightning in a bottle? Had you finished volume 1 at that point?
I think because March Book 1 is written with a much more limited viewpoint. I mean, it is John Lewis as a young person, as a child, as a teenager. Not just from a narrative standpoint, the world is limited, it's much more subjective, but from a historical perspective, the Nashville sit-in movement has very little documentation, relatively speaking. And these are things I didn't appreciate until I really got into it, to recognize that the civil rights movement was able to be the society-changing success it was, in part because of this expansive media coverage, which basically forced it into homes across the country as part of the discussion. But because of the limited level of documentation of the events in book one, I was kind of like set free to just draw the book.
Right.
I didn't have as much accountability.
Sure.
And I was able to kind of play around more on the personal and subjective moments. And I also was not considering the potential readership of the book. Previous to March Book One, I was against considering who might read the books, but it also that required ignoring or choosing to be oblivious to the gatekeepers, like bookstore people, librarians, teachers, who actually choose books and put them in front of people and help facilitate that. But also, like, content-wise, it was weird because, like, you had this hate speech and physical violence, and, like, you have physical mutilation sometimes in the books, and, like, plus you have just, like, basic profanity. Yeah. And so we're like, this is all historical. This all really happened. Right. We're not going to not put any of this in the book. Right. So basically, like, we were like, well, we'll just make the book. We'll just see what happens.
But it also seems to me like if you're being honest about a presentation of a work, you can't think about the audience because that would paralyze you, right?
Well, typically, yes. But this is where March is utterly unlike anything I've ever been involved with. So once the first book came out, and really, that may be one of these moments where March Book One lucked out a little bit in terms of what we put into it and the risks that we took. I mean, there are, like, there are, like, F words scribbled in background speech all throughout that book. It's barely legible, but, like, things could have gone a very different way if those were slightly more legible. But as soon as the book came out in the summer of 2013, a lot of it was physically interacting with teachers who would bring their whole class to meet John Lewis, parents who would bring their entire families, intergenerational comic reading families and groups. That made us recognize what we had done, but I had already started book two, and it made us realize, like, once people would tell us, like, oh, I'm teaching this in my history class in school, we're like, wait, you're teaching not just like this is something in your English class, you're teaching this as history, which it is history. So, but it takes kind of a leap for a comic to be in class as history. But then all of a sudden, we're like, wait, how do you keep a comic in class? How do you keep a history book in history class? We didn't know any of the guidelines, the parameters. So we had to give ourselves crash courses, like, in the ways that we were fortunate and blessed to have this sort of explosive embrace of March. We also were just lucky enough that we had enough lead time to actually figure out the guidelines that would keep this work of history in its place, to give it a fighting chance to be accepted as history.
So, can you give me an example of something that would have kept that out?
Well, we had to learn. Well, we had to learn boring shit like Common Core standards.
Oh, sure.
But I mean, that's like if you don't follow this to the T, especially something like. Well, it's funny to say this. Like 3 years ago, this would seem a little bit of a stretch, and it's not now. It is the explicit goal of a considerable portion of the people running our country to remove this history from our collective memory. So, like, there is an active interest in taking something like March out of the classrooms if it's something that people latch onto. So a lot of it, like the boring stuff, like Common Core standards, like we didn't give a shit about that, but we had to. We're like, and I think Andrew, for being really serious and seeing things I couldn't see, he's like, Nate, no, like, we need to all learn this method of making March, like of assembling information, of knowing how to actually use quotes and use sources, but also it changed the way, like, I add, like in the first book, I added a good amount of incidental dialogue and stuff, And that's just the way I make comics, especially with like these crowd scenes and stuff. But we got to a point where the visibility of March and our level of accountability was such that, you know, by the third book, if we didn't have a quote for something, we could not have someone saying words that were not.
So there's a
accurate.
level of pressure then.
Oh, there's a level of pressure already.
Yeah.
Yeah, things got really crazy.
Yeah.
Those actually led to these moments of revelation and even participation in the historical record that I never would have guessed in my wildest dreams I could get to be a part of.
Right.
Like in March Book 3, it opens with the awful bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama. We knew that it was on Youth Sunday. We knew that it was as Sunday school was ending and before church started. We knew all these things, but when it came, and we knew that the mom of one of the 4 teenage girls who was murdered just went down to the basement bathroom to check on where her daughter and her friends were, and went back up to her Sunday school class. So I knew I had to draw a Sunday school class, but I was like, hey guys, obviously there's a Sunday school lesson. So what's the Sunday school lesson? I have a couple of ideas. And so I had a couple of things that I thought would be topically relevant. I was like, I obviously have to have the Sunday school teacher saying some stuff so that he can be interrupted by the bomb blast. And Lee was like, you don't understand. There was a Sunday school lesson. So if it's not the actual Sunday school lesson, you cannot make it up. This is history. But because March came along at the exact moment in which a lot of these records were either being digitized for the first time or freedom of information requests were becoming more accessible. Lee, as an editor, was doing some fact-checking and, for example, checked out some random NPR piece that was an audio-only, set of interviews about the bombing of the church. And so it had not been transcribed into text, but in the audio interviews on the MP3 file, found out what the actual Sunday school lesson was.
Nice.
But it literally did not exist in print in the world. And so later in the book, there was a major revelation that Lee discovered about Rosa Parks speaking at the end of the Selma Montgomery March on the steps of the Capitol. And he only found that out, it was 2 days before it went to print. He found it out because he was, crossing his T's and dotting his I's and fact-checking. And in the FBI files, thanks to COINTELPRO, J. Edgar Hoover's FBI had bugs and plants everywhere in the crowd during that big speech, recording people, shooting people. But there was an audio file hidden away in like the Indiana Jones vault of the FBI.
Top men.
That had never been transcribed to text. There's just an open MP3.
Wow.
And he's like, oh, this is publicly available now. So he listened to it and was like, holy shit, you guys, Rosa Parks, this has never been documented in a book before. And basically, he transcribed it to text. March Book 3 became the first book to ever to complete, to add this component of history. But it changes my relationship with what history, with what historical documentation is. If this thing that we're doing has a handful of incidents in which we're actually correcting the historical record, it's really weird what falls through the cracks and why, and sometimes for the dumbest reasons. But it seems stupid for society at large to forget that Rosa Parks spoke to bookend the civil rights movement, in John Lewis's opinion, at this talk, and yet because of the way we learn about it as a society, if the documentation isn't there, our concept of historical truth changes too. Anyway.
Yeah, no, that's kind of amazing when you think about it, actually. You're a white Southern male.
Yes.
Was there any place where you struggled with the text, or struggled with your own relationship to the text, or?
In general, a lot of the anxiety about portraying the history or portraying the individuals as characters and doing the cartooning, telling the story, a lot of that was worked out during The Silence of Our Friends, which was also 95% true to life. It was a little bit fictionalized to fit in one book. But that sort of helped me, I don't know, it was kind of like a boot camp, I guess, that helped me be more prepared for March. But there were some ways where, like, Mark Siegel and Callista at First Second, basically we had a little chit chat where they had to make sure that I knew that I was actually being too timid in visual depictions of African American characters in the book. During the course of Silence of Our Friends, I developed we had to have a lot of conversations about the use of hate speech and racial slurs, because it was about Mark Long's life as a kid in the 60s in Texas, and his entire point for including a lot of the use of racial slurs and hate speech in the book were that he wanted to emphasize just how casual it was. And in that regard, like, it's throughout the book, his character is developing an awareness of the casualness and sort of comparing that with what his parents are perceiving about it and what his neighbors and what the town at large is. And so that level of discomfort as a reader is important. But once we got through that book, basically one of my deals for March was that, especially once we had to do a little bit of composite dialogue for just like crowd people or whatever, I kind of had to put out a harder line where, like, I was comfortable with everything that I had to do, but there were certain things where, like, and to this day, like, one of my things is I won't use a racial slur unless it's a direct quote or something that really happened. And I do feel that it is fair to use it.
Part of the record.
Yes. And obviously, like, that has even more leeway with telling John Lewis's story and the story of the Civil Rights Movement.
Absolutely.
But even like Cakewalk, which is a story that my wife Rachel wrote about a different dimension of American racism, in northwestern Indiana in the 80s, and her experiences of like adults failing at imparting why you should or shouldn't do certain things. Like, with each project, I had to arrive at a place where I was okay including what I was including. But when it comes back to March, there were troubling and weird moments, but it would always come back around to it not being about me. My job was to tell John Lewis's story through his eyes and in his words. And he was trusting me to do that. And, really, like, that's the difference between, like, actually being concerned about something and being anxious about it. Like, almost all of it is just anxiety. Once you recenter yourself around that, you're like, oh, right, I do have a job to do, and I've chosen to do it.
And you ended up winning the National Book Award.
Right.
Which, like, you're the only comic that's, I mean, not you, but the whole team, right?
Yes.
That's pretty amazing. Is this
wild?
Is this like a black tie affair?
Oh yeah, I made a fake tuxedo.
Okay.
I bought a bow tie, and then I think I actually had to buy a cummerbund.
Okay.
And the rest was like my regular suit looked tuxy enough.
Right.
But I was like, that's good. I saved like a couple $100.
Yeah.
But I was like, bow tie changes everything.
Yeah.
But yeah, it was a black tie affair.
Yeah. That's amazing. I mean, in a way, it's one of those industry-changing things, like Mouse winning the Pulitzer. I feel like, do you feel weight from that now, right? Like, because I'm sure at the moment it was like, oh my God, this is a big deal. But like, has it changed the way you create comics? I guess is the question that I'm asking.
The short answer to that is no. Backing up half a step, when we won it, it was like a week after Election Day in 2016.
Yeah.
And like everybody's heads were spinning. And so within the National Book Awards crowd, it was just this very empowering, supportive thing where like, we are people who believe in ideas, who make books, and we are here to celebrate ideas. And it was just this nice little respite from the hellmouth we just opened up.
Sure.
But the next morning I had to get a red-eye flight back home to commence daddy duties again. And it was mid-November, so I was like, maybe on Thanksgiving break at some point it'll hit me that March won the National Book Award.
Right.
And then I was like busy doing dad stuff, and then my parents showed up or whatever, and I was like, maybe over Christmas break it'll hit me that this is a super big deal.
Right.
And then Christmas break passed, and I was like, now I'm just busy again. And it's not that simple, but in a lot of ways, like, the work never ends. And finally I was backed up on work. Like, the nuts and bolts of life never stopped.
Sure.
The clock in San Dimas.
Yeah.
So, in short, it is nice after that, and being afforded, a lot of it is thanks to the visibility and sales of March, that afforded me a little bit of a window where I could just draw and write Come Again for a whole year, basically. Sure. But like, now that I finally have a book out after March, not only was that very much like returning to my home planet, but it's kind of, in terms of perspective, it's nice to be like, oh right, like Sic Transit Gloria. Yeah. Like, you've always got to put in the work. Yeah. Like, people forget about these things over time.
Sure.
And what's important is that you're continuing to move forward with new ideas. Yep. And I don't know. So like, we continue to try to, it's more important than ever, obviously, to keep March alive in the public consciousness, but also it requires more conscious effort to keep it alive. Sure. It's less self-propelled. So it's kind of like splitting.
I almost feel like today it's more self-propelled just because of who's in the White House. You know what I mean?
Well, you would think so, but like, along the course of March, of making March book by book, my understanding of the people who are putting in their own independent effort to get March in schools and in bookstores, like, these are things which are independent from my ability to control them.
Absolutely.
And when March was the only thing any of us did, we were able to devote all of our energy to staying on top of that. And so once you go on and you have other things to do, Congressman Lewis has the world to save. Sure. You see how that trails off a bit. Sure. So, but all books have their active lifespan. Sure. And they have their legacy lifespan.
Yeah, but March is going to be taught in schools for the next 50 years.
I hope so.
Almost certainly.
I hope so.
I mean, I'm not trying to blow smoke or anything. I just feel like that it's one of those rare works that's going to do that, and
Thanks.
And that's a pretty fantastic thing. So let's talk about this a little bit. So you were working with other writers for 6-7 years there as your primary cartooning. Yeah. Was it a gear shift to go working by yourself again, doing your own work, your own voice?
Well, throughout the process, like, I finished Any Empire, my previous solo graphic novel, in early 2011, came out that summer. And so I was already writing Come Again by that point in an earlier version. And throughout the March trilogy, I would, every 6 months or so, I would probably spend a month where I was trying consciously to spend more time writing and penciling it. I'd pencil like 40 to 60 pages and throw it in the stack. I would decide, like, the casserole had to go back in the oven.
Right.
But also, like, the demands and responsibilities of March simply did not provide for the bandwidth required to work on it. So over the process of those years and years where I was collaborating with people on books, specific, and especially with March, I guess, I think as a storyteller, my concreteness and my ability to communicate with clarity got much better. Sure. And I was just in such a tunnel of work that it was hard for me to see those things advancing until I was done and I was actually, ready to finish penciling this book. Yeah. But yes, to speak specifically of Come Again, as soon as I was ready to wrap up the pencils and start inking, I could tell that there had been a long, like a pressure cooker, slowly slowly refining those things that I could bring back into my own weird, intuitive stories with a new kind of concreteness and clarity. And also, it's just like, it's satisfying in a way that collaborations can never be.
Sure. Was it easy to use those muscles again, though?
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
that was the thing where it was as if I had never stopped just
nice.
drawing my own weird
Nice.
stories every day.
Yeah. That's nice.
It's always there waiting for you.
Yeah. Let me go to all these people here who have been really good. I've been speaking for an hour. I'm sorry. I do this all the time, I know, but I get into the conversation. Do you guys have any questions for Nate? Yeah, please.
Working by yourself, I was curious if you did like a full script when you were doing Come Again, or if you just kind of loosely like written down like what this page is gonna do, if you just like penciled it straight out of your head.
Generally speaking, I don't script things, and I never have. One time I did kind of an outline of Swallow Me Whole just so Top Shelf could see what was going on, and when I had lines that I knew were in it, I would just throw them in there. But it was an unstructured Word document. This is what happens in it. It was not a script. I've never done a script, except I did a screenplay for Swallow Me Whole a few years ago, which was very fun. So my general method basically is I almost immediately know what the big idea is, the major questions, the major themes, the thing I need to express. I usually have gathered kind of vignettes, little moments of overheard things or memories, little slivers of scenes or experiences or lines that I might think of or that I might have overheard someone say. And I kind of, when it comes time to actively write something like Come Again, once a character develops who I actually really care about, I'm oh, this is clearly a main character in this book. It comes down to taking all those vignettes and all those moments and physically putting them on little tiny pieces of paper and getting on the floor and visually moving them around to see if the scenes might have, or the moments might have relationships to each other. And then while you're doing that, being mindful of what the bigger themes and questions are and seeing how these scenes, these moments might relate to the bigger themes. And basically I'll just play with tiny pieces of paper for a month. And then, before long, a story actually starts to emerge.
Now, is this over the whole 200-plus page scope of the book, or are you kind of doing it in chunks?
Yeah, for Come Again, it had a lot of false starts. So, in the end, now the book exists, that was sort of to my advantage. I would go through these periods where I was penciling a book, and it wasn't even in our geopolitical reality. It was on some, alternate, Earth-like sci-fi fantasy world. But each false start, as I was bringing it back to our world, then back to Arkansas, then to the Ozarks in a weird hippie village, by that point that we had gotten into this world building that's in the published book, I didn't need to do those exercises as much anymore. I feel like the major things have been worked out. But a lot of moments like the appearance of Arkansas's fictional first punk band, Diamond Mine, happen. I mean, it's separate from the plot, basically. It's something that has to do with the larger tone and themes of the book, but it has nothing. They just Boba Fett the book.
Right.
They have nothing to do with the book. But that's my favorite part of the book. It's the best part to draw. It's the best part to read.
Sure.
But yeah, those things will emerge, and again, this sounds like a cliche, but those are moments where you're oh, the book is making decisions on its own.
Sure, yeah.
The characters develop a life of their own. But those are the moments you wait for, where you're oh, obviously, this is going to happen here. And I don't have a reason worked out, but because I'm not as strong of a writer as an artist, this is where, in order to make A to Z sense, especially through the course of this book, I've discovered that I personally have to do a lot of reverse engineering to figure out what happens in the plot to justify certain things that I want to draw or see or whatever. The best, like the most concrete example of this is the way Haluska, the main character, looks. Well, really, let's just even go just to her hair. I designed her in this exact outfit in 2008. And I was like, this character looks cool. I want her to look like that. Let's go with that. But once I figured out where and when the story was taking place, I was like, okay, we're in Northwest Arkansas in the mountains in the late 70s in a hippie village. And you know, like there were certain things that I could come up with, like her weird, like futuristic, new wave, stripy black and white dress. I had to reverse engineer her exact age so that she could have had a go-go dress in the mid-late 60s as a teenager that she held on to and then repurposed, unstitched and restitched in this new design. But with her hair, I was like, okay, she lives in a rural community. Obviously, there are farm animals. It's like, why is she shaving her head? I was like, well, clearly there are lice or ticks. So I'm like, okay, so there's a thing where there are lice and she has to shave her head. But I was like, why is only half her head shaven? And then you have to be like, okay, so maybe she gets somebody to shave her head, but they have to stop. Why do they have to stop? And her kid Jake already existed at this point. It's like, well, that'll be her kid. So she gets her kid to shave her head. They're helping out with farm animals. Obviously, like she has lice. And then why does she stop? And then I'm like, okay. And by this point, I had a kid who was old enough that I think I was just on the cusp of, okay, secret, all little kids get lice at some point. So let's just get that out in the air. Your kid doesn't have lice until they have lice. So this was right around the time that in real life, I finally encountered lice. Mm-hmm. It sucks. Okay. But, you know, then I was like, okay, so maybe there aren't lice. So I had to be like, okay, she has to be looking and noticing that she can't find lice. And then maybe he's having too much fun getting to use clippers for the first time and he just won't stop. But she makes him stop. Right. And then I'm like, okay, so then you have to play that scene out just to its natural conclusion. Like that's why only half her head is shaved, but it involves what he perceives or possibly imagines is happening based on what he's learning with his expanding worldview, and he wants to participate and be responsible. But she's not even sure if he's lying or not in the opening scene. Like she doesn't get a straight answer. She's like, okay, just stop. I need to know, did you see anything in my hair? And he's just like, they're all gone now. And then he just goes back to playing with the clippers, and she's like, well, fuck it, I can't, you know, like, I'm not going to get an answer out of this. And that became an entire scene just to rationalize the way she looks. But then that also means that it immediately extends the life of the character beyond the pages of the book. So literally, her whole adult life, until we open the book, she has looked a different way. The first time we see her is the first instant she looks the way she looks in the book. And so the lifespan of the book is the entirety of her looking that way, just for that window of time. And it's funny because like you design a character and you don't, you know, like I never thought until I had to think about what the fact that this is not her default look, this is not her intended look, right? But that I like that her ex-husband Gus appreciates the futuristic getup she has in terms of the repurposed, apparently recently repurposed go-go dress into this new outfit, but that he appreciates the futuristic look of her hair, and she doesn't have time or interest in telling her that it was because of a fake lice scare. Mm-hmm. None of that made it into the book, but it's in between the lines of the script.
Nice. Yeah, nice.
So I just have to make shit up to draw the things I want to draw.
Did that answer your question? Do you have a follow-up?
I mean, I have follow-ups, but there's other people.
You're a better man than me.
Very considerate.
All right, other people. Who else has a question that you would like to ask?
I'm just wondering, coming off of March, which was so research intensive, what was your relationship coming back to your own work with research?
Well, what was nice was that I, in terms of the discipline of doing reference and research for March, I was basically set free again. I could have just pulled all this out of my imagination / ass, and this is my home state, and I was 1 year old when this takes place, but I was comfortable enough that I could have. Earlier versions of the book, were sans research. It was strictly from the realms of my imagination. But thanks to the change in my creative mindset of March, it made it so that I can no longer not ask those questions. Like, and a lot of it is just pursuing my own casual interest. Like, I guess really the setup of Haven Station, the village itself. When I started whipping up the village and everything, I'm like, okay, it's this off the grid, intentional hippie community. Cool. I know what that looks like, basically, and that's fine. But there were certain things where like I wanted to have a turntable or light switches, or I started drawing light switches without thinking about it. I was like, wait, like, how are they getting electricity in their individual homes? And then I was like, well, it obviously has to be solar power, but when were commercial grade solar cells available? And then I'm like, oh, 1978, how convenient. And then you do a little more like cursory research, and you're like, oh, and in fact, Back to the Landers kind of led the charge with home use of solar cells. I'm like, how convenient. And so sometimes I'll luck out with things like that I did not have eyes for that kind of stuff before March. Also with something like Diamond Mine, the Arkansas's first punk band. Arkansas's first punk band was called the Malls, but they were out of 1979, Northwest Arkansas. In my whole punk life, I've been aware that the Sex Pistols went on a 2-week tour, mostly of the southern United States. Their last show ever was here in San Francisco with the immortal, you ever get the feeling you've been cheated line. But before they made it here, it was strictly the American South. And Arkansas, or Little Rock, didn't get a punk scene until the mid-'80s, after Black Flag played there on their last tour. But Sex Pistols played Memphis, Dallas, San Antonio, and Tulsa, Oklahoma, and skipped Arkansas. So all those places immediately got punk scenes in the late 70s. Northwest Arkansas got a punk scene in the late 70s because a handful of those people went to go see the Pistols in Tulsa. Now I knew that, but prior to Research Mind of March, like, that meant nothing to me. But all of a sudden I was like, wait, that's a real thing that happened. Like, who are the 100 people who saw the Pistols in Tulsa, Oklahoma in 1978? And then you're like, oh, there are local newscasts on YouTube that are actually covering the Pistols show in Oklahoma. Nice. And you're like, those are the individuals. These are interviews with these real people. Yeah. And so I had this band in mind that was emerging, but I was like, wait a minute. One of the people in this band, at least one of them, is one of the 100 people who went to go see the Pistols. And then, like, in Please... No, it's not in Please Kill Me. Yeah, no, it is in Please Kill Me. There's an account of going on tour with the Pistols on this tour, and specifically outside of the Tulsa show, they stopped at a Waffle House or whatever, and there was a cowboy family. Basically, there's a cowboy dad with the whole family, and the teenage daughter had basically made the whole family take her to go see the Pistols. And the Pistols happened to be at this Waffle House or whatever, and this is during Sid Vicious, who could not play bass, by the way. Sid Vicious, at the height of his like shock value, was basically just trying to freak out this cowboy family, and sat down at their table and was being leery or whatever, and stabbed a fork, into his hand, just to freak them out. And it didn't freak them out that much. So it was kind of a wasted, kind of crucial injury if you're on tour. But anyway, turns out that that family, according to what research I've been able to do, the dad got irate as the band was like leaving town after the show, because his daughter wanted to like hit the road with the Sex Pistols, and they were like, Like, no, thank you. We're just gonna go. We're gonna leave. We're gonna drive to New Mexico or whatever. And the dad was like, what do you mean? I was like trying to fight the Sex Pistols in the parking lot that they wouldn't abduct his teenage daughter because that's what she wanted. And it was like, what do you mean you're going to say them? And I was like, there's something here. And that whole family is probably still alive. So like, but I just try to use that as a springboard instead of like pretending that that's actually that person.
Sure.
But you know, like, there are these moments where like the interests that I might have casually in life, now I have a new set of eyes, I think, where I'm like, oh, it's possible to actually find out information that's applicable with something I'm doing, to enrich what I'm doing, to make it less just kind of pulled out of my butt.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
You have a follow-up? Go ahead, Michael.
First, really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Oh, thanks.
And you were talking about characters and having lives of their own and kind of them steering things. Kind of a two-part question. One, do you see the Diamond Mine and their abductees kind of going off into some other project you want to do? And also with the Secret Eater, what happened in terms of you getting your mind into that creature, that character? Did you find your secrets kind of playing off of it in some way?
Let's see. I think in terms of the creation of the Secret Eater, in an earlier kind of sci-fi fantasy, otherworldly version of this book, it involved a city, an isolated city made of a weird substance, like a mushy substance, but at night, while everyone was asleep, the whole city rearranged itself. Everyone woke up, and basically their whole economy, their whole culture was based around, you wake up, you find out where you are, like where your job is, where your family is, where your friends are, but you have to be back inside by nighttime again, or else, like, if you miss a cycle of this, you may essentially be lost forever. You know, like, it's imperative that you get these basic things done every day, and it takes up most of the day. But underneath the city, there was kind of a static, secret grove of trees and caves. And in more of like a wormhole-y quantum physics way, it was a way to kind of like bypass the entire changing cityscape and get where you needed to go, but it was a realm that very few people knew about. And then once I started to play around in there, this entity emerged. And at that point, it was like, I decided that, you know, because like you're less afraid of something once you know more about it, once you know what it looks like, its name, where it's coming from. So I wanted it to be formless and nameless. I wanted it to be nothing. So I had all these old drawings where I was like, well, I guess it has to be something. I made like this weird little like bean shape that had some eyes. And like that month, I started reading Gabriella Giandelli's incredible Interiori comic, which Fantagraphics put out in the early 2010s. It's one of my favorite comics of all time. So if you can get it, if let's say you happen to be at a comic book store at some point, then I highly recommend getting it. But it turns out that that series takes place in a single apartment complex, and it has to do with the interior and dream lives and relationships of all the inhabitants. But it turns out it's being controlled in dream time by this dark, bean-shaped demon creature in the basement with these little eyes. And as soon as I saw it, I was like, well, I guess nobody's ever going to see my demon. But once I realized that it had to be completely invisible, and also when I realized that those forest grove things in the caves were where the characters were participating in things that were more secret, more intimate, more private. That was before basically like the hippie vibe, the eternal openness vibe, the tension which makes that important in Come Again. That didn't exist yet. So once that kind of reemerged in the final version of the book, where you're living in a community that thrives off of openness and knowing each other's business at all times, suddenly there was a reason to have a sacred space for secret stuff and a place to pursue private interests. And then everything kind of fell into place. But I don't know, like I have a voice in my head for the Secret Eater but I feel like nothing specific from my life entered into the secrecy subplots or the way the Secret Eater goes after them. But the ways in which, like, I don't know, a lot of it changed pre-parenthood and post-parenthood. There are the ways, more like in a relationship sense, where you withhold things from the people around you, but you can only like, you know, hold back people's access to the truth as it involves all of you for so long. And then as a parent, you have a duty to kind of hold, you know, to ration out reality, ration out truth at a kid's level so they're equipped to handle the world, but to keep from like crushing their fragile souls. And so there was this weird protective tension there. After I'd already decided what the Secret Eater was and how it operated and everything, I don't even remember how I stumbled across this, but there's this, I see you have the Secret of Kells. Huh, interesting. As it turns out that I discovered there's a Celtic/Ethiopian god demon creature known as Cromdub or Crom-Cruach or the Crooked Dark One, that, like, the Wicker Man, the whole apparatus behind that, the celebration and the dark entity, that's the same creature, Crom-Cruach, that appears to be originally Ethiopian, and then Ethiopian travelers went to what is now Ireland at some point, like in the Bronze Age or whatever, and lo and behold, it became part of Celtic folklore. But yeah, it involves like around July 31st in Celtic lore, beginning of the harvest season. If you've seen The Wicker Man, you know there's like a human sacrifice. In the Celtic tradition, it's a child sacrifice in exchange for, you know, a healthy harvest, and basically it goes back under the ground. You're trying to appease it, and I like the comparisons to like Those Who Walk Away from Omelas, the short story by Ursula Le Guin of like the sacrifice a community has to make on a small but horrible level to have their utopia function. But also I liked the idea that, well, I was like, if this god demon creature can travel culturally from Ethiopia to Ireland, why can't it literally be the same entity that's like basically traveling underneath the earth to Arkansas? So there are a lot of ghost legends in Arkansas, and I've seen some crazy shit in Arkansas. Like my best friend's house had a poltergeist. I've seen that. I've heard it. It's real. I got kicked out of an apartment of mine by a poltergeist. It's real. I've seen some weird stuff. So I liked entertaining the notion that especially the Arkansas that I know can be so wrapped up in folklore and in pursuing legends and demons, spirits. And a lot of young people's relationships to each other, in my experience, can be tied around that kind of thrill, that kind of possibility opening up. But I also like the idea that of all the legends that they were pursuing, that it happened that a component of it was very real and was actually guiding them when they were not aware.
Follow up?
The Diamond Mine question, you had nodded at the beginning. I don't know if the life that they have.
Oh, yes. Yeah, so Diamond Mine are, like, I really got into Diamond Mine. And the more I drew them, the more I wanted to draw them, and the more I wanted to know what brought them to make this weird, almost punk band that didn't quite fit. So they are going to be the main characters in my next graphic novel, which is, it's a book I started writing it as an autobiographical thing in like 2007. And just never did anything with it. But the basic idea will be, I want to do a book that's about going on tour with a band of people you're very close to, but without the music. It's basically eating together, sleeping together, and driving together, which is 95% of what it is to be in a band or to go on tour. And but the goal is to like always cut off a scene before music actually starts. And I haven't figured out how I'm going to do it. I've I've got some time. I'm real backed up on my for hire work.
Yeah.
But yeah, as soon as they wrote, like, it was nice that they could Boba Fett it and then drive off to the Oklahoma state lines, knowing that I would see them again. You know, like, at a certain point, I knew I had to cut the scene, but I was like, I know I'm coming back to y'all, so I'll try to actually make this as teaserific as possible.
When you talk about the difference between your for hire work and your for you work, I
Yeah.
suppose, what kind of a balance are you trying to achieve in your life?
Well, it used to be that I was able to have a 50-50 balance. I would simultaneously write and draw my own book, and I would draw someone else's book, who would, you know, almost always be my friend,
Sure.
and someone I admired,
Sure.
etc. And I've been very lucky that I think all my collaborations have been with buddies. More or less, like, now that my kids are getting older, and like, they're so demanding. I've discovered I just can't do that anymore. And so, like, even when I had just one kid who was a baby, you know, I had a level of flexibility, and it seemed crazy at the time, but now I look back and I'm like, oh wow, I could just do whatever. I can still, like, my time is very, very strictly regimented by what I have to do as a parent now. And so, like, I just turned 40, and part of that is being like, I know now that I cannot do what I've done for the last 10 years.
Right.
I cannot have a 50-50 balance. So my immediate goal after finishing Two Dead, which is my next book, it's written by Van Jensen, and then I'm going to do another book with Cecil Castellucci that we've been writing together for like 3 years. But once those are done, my goal is to figure out a way to just make my own weird comics. And you know, that's the weird crossroads part, where if I can figure out a way so that I can remain, you know, working with Top Shelf, who
Yeah.
are essentially my family, and it's an irreplaceable relationship, then that's what I aim to do. But then also there's the second question: if I'm not able to do that, but I'm able to get a lot more money from a company owned by a book publisher,
Sure.
but people who are not my friends and
Sure.
not my family,
Sure.
then that's going to be a whole different set of questions and sacrifices.
Like this might be too pushy of a question, but I mean, can you survive off of the back end of March at this point, just doing your own work going forward?
Last year I could.
Yeah.
But basically it's like, yeah, like, March sells very well. If I didn't have kids, yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, yes,
Yeah.
definitely. But like, I have to make exponentially, like, you know, it's
Sure.
It's not just like affording one person versus 3 or 4 people.
Yep.
But it's like, the more money you make as a self-employed person, you disproportionately
Yep.
have to make more money
Yep.
for taxes to
Yep.
pay off.
Yep.
And it just disappears.
Yep.
So it's
Self-employed person, I
yeah,
know.
it very
Yep.
quickly puts you in an
Yep.
impossible position.
Yep.
So
Well, and you want so much more for your kids too than you had. I mean, you want,
oh sure,
like,
But-
they're going to good colleges, I assume, right? You know.
that's up to them.
Sure, obviously, but you're going to be in the position. I mean, you're working to put yourself in the position where they
Right.
can, obviously,
yeah,
right?
And well, as soon as, like, when March was selling at its best, that was like the very first thing I did.
Yeah.
Was be like, there's money to put away for
Yeah.
college if colleges exist in 15 years.
Yeah, yeah,
And
Yeah.
or, you know, like, it's good for, you know, tools in the salt mines.
Yeah.
You just need to go work in the
Sure.
salt mines from our overlords,
sure,
from the, you know, from the regime.
yeah,
Yeah, so basically, it's outrageously more expensive just to survive as a family unit than I was prepared for. And so, even though March continues to sell well, it still has not arrived at a point where it'll have, like, where I actually know what its permanent baseline level of sales is.
understood.
And so I'm still kind of in that netherworld where I'm just like, still just continue to work as hard as I can, do as much work as possible, because you don't know when.
You
the
don't know
shit's gonna
when.
dry up.
You don't know when.
Yes.
Questions from the room? Yes. Yeah.
I was curious if
You and me, Rick.
being a part of like the punk scene back in the '80s, if you weren't a part of that group, do you feel like your art would be any different
Yes.
today, or like the direction you went in comics, would it be different?
Yes. I think, okay, while I was self-publishing my, dystopian guns and boobs superhero comics, I was already, like, putting out tapes and records of my bands, starting to make fanzines. I was in bands, going to shows. All that was happening at the same time, but I was also, every couple of months, making submissions to Marvel Comics. And even, like, once I stopped reading superhero comics, in the pre-internet Arkansas, not being aware of comics that weren't superhero comics meant that, like, even when I was at SVA, and I had nothing to do with superhero comics, it still pretty much seemed like if I wanted to draw comics, that seemed to be the path. So it was thanks to people unrelated to punk, at least at the time, with my limited knowledge of them, like forcing a copy of I Never Liked You by Chester Brown onto my hands and being like, you need to read this now. And that being the book that changed my comics life forever. But there's a little crossover too, like Al Burian, a cartoonist, zine writer, musician, involved in both comics and punk. He had some mini comics. One of them was called The Long Walk Nowhere that came out in '96. And that comic predated my reading of I Never Liked You by a year or so. But reading that comic, which just had to do with him walking around at night in his hometown in North Carolina and walking, having memories of being a disaffected 12-year-old and walking down the same streets at the same time. And then at the end of the comic, the sun starts to come up and he goes inside and makes a cup of coffee. That's it. I wasn't even aware that you were able to tell a story where that's what happened. So that one Al Burian comic is the thing that actually, like, put the crowbar in the door, let me see that other things were possible. And I Never Liked You made me realize that there was an ocean of comics that were following different narratives, but also laying out comics in different ways. Like a lot of I was like enamored and confused by the way Chester Brown was laying out his pages, panel to panel, but I didn't know until later that he would draw each panel individually and cut them out, and then he would tape them on another sheet of paper to arrange them and arrange the flow. That's the reason I lay out my pages the way I do, is thanks to that book. And that's the reason why I use so much black in my comics. By the way, I highly recommend reading I Never Liked You, but if you do, you should go on eBay and get an earlier version that has black gutters and margins. All the new versions just have white. It's not the same book.
Not the same book at all.
Not the same
not
book.
Even a little
That's
bit.
What I'm saying.
Yeah. No, I agree with that 100%. Yeah.
So I do think that in my speculation, I think that if I still would have like gone to art school in New York City, but without the DIY ethic or whatever, I probably would have stayed in New York, taken a more traditional path, and I probably would have started interning at Marvel, because I grew up as a Marvel kid, and I would hopefully be drawing Daredevil or X-Men at this point, because that would be my life's goal up until that point, for sure. So the desire was still very strong then, but it required people showing me that other possibilities even existed. Much less that I could desire those things, or that I was interested in making something like that. Bring it on.
Go.
When you got to SVA, or from my experience from being at the Academy of Art, there was this one guy who all he wanted to do was draw Marvel and DC.
Sure.
That's fine. You want to do that? It's totally great. But in the back of my head, I was like, why would you kind of like waste your time doing that? Did you have any like people like that, and who were like shoving you like, oh no, you gotta work with the big two, and in the back of your head you were like, why though?
Well, I feel like that is inseparable from the ways in which comics as an industry and a community have changed in the last 15 to 20 years. Yes, there were plenty of people in my classes like that. However, it wasn't as pointed. I think it wasn't as much that the question was even being asked, like, why would or wouldn't you want to do that? I think I was closer to that perspective for the first half of my being in art school, before I was able to be like, oh, what I'm doing can be the thing I do. But also, like, well, first off, we're in a really beautiful time in comics where folks from my generation who in the early mid 2000s started making self-published and indie work are now able to have a catalog of creator-owned independent stuff and are now being asked to write or draw or color for Big Two books. And all of, like, for those of us who grew up on that never goes away. I would drop anything at any time, not true. I would drop anything at any time to draw the X-Men. And that's still like 70% true. Even though, like, I don't understand X-Men when I read the issues, when I pick the new issues up, but I still buy the issues every 3 months or so. I'll catch up and be like, let's see if I can understand the continuity. Nope. But yeah, like, it's like Matthew Rosenberg. He's a punk friend of mine from 20 years ago. We met at, my band played a record release show for a band whose record he put out, and we met by my buying a record from him on a sidewalk, and we just sort of stayed in touch over time. And so, like, he always had independent projects. I'm just saying that because I'm staring at X-Men comics. But, like, we have much more parallel paths than it would seem, in that up until 3 or 4 years ago, like, I even worked with him on a Ghostface Killa comic about 5 years ago. But, like, if any independent creator, I think, who is over a certain age, I'd say over 30, because I think maybe that is where there is is the phrase a seawater change or whatever? Is that what it is? Yeah, a sea tide thing. Yeah, one of those things happened where, it's not de facto that you grow up reading Marvel or DC Comics. But if someone is in their 30s, 40s, 50s, I think it's fairly safe to assume that was their experience as an independent creator. And a lot of that is thanks to manga being available on bookshelves in bookstores in America, and, like, a mass influx of female readers who then grew up to be female creators, changing the entire culture and industry of comics for the better. So these things, you can't extrapolate that from the equation. But what I am saying is that I don't see it as being as binary of a thing. What makes comics as a whole so good right now is the fact that people are, like, ready to bounce back and forth, and people who are able continue to make Big Two work while they're making their own creator-owned stuff.
Yeah, and the thing that I'll say is that, I mean, we've certainly talked to any number of cartoonists who are doing creator-owned work, doing personal work, and who are not exactly making what we would call a living at it. Okay, And I think that even today, if you're looking at, I want to be able to pay a rent and have a family and do those things, the easiest thing for a lot of people is, let's just work at the Big Two,
right?
Because it's guaranteed money. They're paying you a page rate, as opposed to you're just getting, maybe it hits and maybe it doesn't. I mean, I'm sure you can see any number of what ifs in your life where you didn't get March and you're right.
Yes. But on the flip side of that, if March didn't happen in my life, like, I had to turn down a lot of projects during the course of doing March, and so sometimes I do think about how utterly different life would be, in that all these other gigs that would not have been telling the story of John Lewis, but would have been like, this is fun, it's with your buddy, and you get paid money for it.
But in a way, it's really only the last decade or so where that's actually been viable.
Yes.
I mean, there's a lot of people who
I
wanted to do that for many years and it couldn't work, and just the math didn't work on it.
I agree.
So, sorry, I don't mean to be a bummer, I just, want to make sure we're realistic about it.
If I could, I would draw Spider-Man 24/7.
There you go.
Sure.
Yeah. Spidey's cool.
Somebody has to draw Spider-Man.
Somebody's got to trust.
Somebody has to draw Spider-Man, preferably me, but
Yep.
somebody has to.
And Spider-Man has to come out every single month, no matter what. It's not, it's not like a create-your-own book. You put it out when you put it out,
Yeah.
Do we have any other questions from the crowd? No? Yes? No? Maybe? All right. It's like a couple. Oh, Michael's got one more.
What is your favorite X-Men?
Who's your favorite X-Men?
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for asking. My favorite X-Men are Rogue, Nightcrawler, Longshot, Storm. No, I'll put Storm above Longshot. And then, people pretend like Wolverine is he's like overdone or whatever, but I haven't been keeping up with X-Men since 1995. I'll put Wolverine at number 5. He's an amazing character.
Very good.
I also don't know his real history.
Right.
So I'm blessed by not getting into the swamp of continuity.
Yeah.
So yeah.
I won't say anything.
Rogue is number 1 though.
Yeah.
Rogue is clearly the best X-Man.
Is that because she's Southern?
Oh, I forgot that she's Southern.
Okay, no, I'm just asking. I mean,
Okay, what I really like about Rogue is obviously being Captain Obvious. Her powers, her curse.
yeah.
But
No, exactly. No, which is what makes all good X-Men X-Men.
But the tension between it's what makes X-Men a cut above
Yeah.
other superhero comics.
Yeah.
Like the fact that it's fundamentally a relationship book.
Sure.
It is a soap opera.
Sure.
But the fact that it involves like there are perhaps initially unintended reflections on her objectification as a young woman going through puberty, but also as that relates to her mutation, and basically her power, her curse being her entire body.
Yeah.
And but then the doubler where she absorbs Miss Marvel's
Yep.
Captain Marvel's powers
Yep.
forever and consciousness, and has this weird this battle that's happening. See, I stopped reading X-Men before this whole thing where she can touch people.
Yeah.
And I don't even know if she has Carol Danvers in her
I
anymore.
don't think she does anymore.
She doesn't.
Yeah.
That's why she's able to touch people now.
Yeah.
Because the Kree DNA kept her from evolving as a mutant.
Oh, she is. Wait, whoa, hold on.
Thank you, Doug.
Wait.
Oh God. Wait a minute. All right, it's an X-Men conversation.
I just
All
need
right.
to know one thing.
Yeah.
She has Kree DNA in her?
When she absorbed Carol Danvers' powers, she somehow her mutation took on Kree DNA.
Okay.
And the Kree,
Sure.
the Kree's whole thing is they can't they're at an evolutionary dead end. So she couldn't grow any stronger as long as she had Carol's powers.
I see.
So.
All right, I'm down with X-Men conversation. No, it's fine. But I don't want to end it there. So let me ask you. Let's go to the craft lightning round. You pen and paper, yeah?
Yeah, all physical.
Yeah, all physical. Do you scan it?
I do.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm 40, so my class in high school was the last class before there was computers in my school. Mm-hmm. And then when I went to art school, my class was the last class before cartooning students were required to have any computer class.
Yeah.
I just did not learn shit about how to use a computer in our craft.
Right.
So when it was time to scan Swallow Me Whole, I got my best friend to sit me down for 2 hours and teach me how to assemble multiple scans. Mm-hmm. And how to use the eraser, how to use the pencil function. Mm-hmm. I really have not advanced much since then. But I really haven't. I don't know how to work in layers.
Right.
That's right. I don't know how to get another layer going. I don't know how to cut things out and drop them out. I can't do any of that shit. But a lot of it is I know that I could just learn, but I don't have time to sit down and learn. So since it's working, I just keep going.
Yeah.
Occasionally, if something is way above my pay grade, I'll kick it back to my friend who taught me in the first place. Mm-hmm. And I'm like, Aaron, can you just fix this for me, please? Here's $10.
Nice.
And then she'll be like, there it is.
$10 whole dollars.
She'll be like, this took 1 minute. And she'll be like, there you go. I'm like, thank you.
Oh. Yeah, give me an hour's worth of work at that rate.
Yes,
right?
yes, indeed. So all physical still.
Yeah.
But it keeps me fast, and I don't have time to slow down.
So someone kind of mentioned this in passing, and I gave a really flip answer. There's an awful lot of black on every page.
Yes.
Are you spotting these blacks yourself? Are you? How are you?
There are only a few, like the super minimal chapter breaks that might have just the cave door or a glow.
Yeah.
Those are the only ones where I won't take the black all the way to the edges of the pages.
Right.
But usually you have to find a line like those. If I black them all the way in, the paper will curl enough that I can't flatten it. But everything else I just go all the way. And the kind of ink I use, Speedball Super Black India ink.
There you go.
I buy it in a pint jar, and I love it. It's just really tarry and stuff, but it always goes bad. But no matter how much ink I use, by the time I get to the bottom, it goes bad. So it's an incentive to be extra liberal with the black ink. Like, I literally cannot use enough of it. It does not matter.
That's an interesting craft note.
Yeah.
I can't use enough, so I've just got to layer it on.
It's nice though. Like,
Yeah.
I do not consider my ink use because I cannot use it fast enough.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Coloring. Are you coloring yourself? What's the deal?
Yes. Yeah. So all my colors in this are done. Well, first there's a gray layer, a la March, that's a little more simplified, but it's still 3 layers of gray, just with the India ink that I water down.
Mm-hmm.
The colors are done using FW brand acrylic artist's ink / watercolor dyes, but they're in those little droppers, and I buy a crimson, process yellow, and I buy like a Prussian or indigo blue, and I use those to mix up every single color. And very occasionally, I think just for the purples in that book, I'll add like a drop of black. And then basically it's like I pencil, I do the lettering, then I ink, I erase, I blow dry the page, then I add the grays, then I blow dry the page, then I add the color layers and blow dry the page. So I had to step back up to a toothier paper for this to absorb the extra layer of water.
Yeah, sure.
So I used a toothier paper for March Book 1 and went back to a smoother paper for 2 and 3 because it was messing up my lettering. So I had to figure out a new way to write the lettering for this book so it wouldn't like get rubbed off while I was erasing.
Have you, I really admire the fact that you're hand lettering. A number of cartoonists that I've talked to have been taking consideration foreign translations and things like that.
Sure.
Like, oh my God, I can no longer hand letter because we need to be able to just swap out the computer files.
Well, I have noticed like that you have friends who do that. They will still rule out the balloons sometimes and just put nothing in them.
Mm-hmm.
Which seems like if you're going to go that far, you might as well just go ahead and letter it.
Right.
But yeah, number one, hand lettering saves time. Anything you letter, you don't have to ink. That, to me, that's the bottom line.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, if you just go ahead and just write the lettering in, that's that much more shit you don't have to ink.
Mm-hmm.
You can work faster, and it's fine. Also, more importantly, it's like the only way to actually make the lettering a part of the art, to make it a part of the experience of the book, and there's potential that you will not see if you are doing them as separate components. I don't know. I'm not going to die on this hill, but it's a little, I don't know, like, I'm not so sure that you can really, like, make comics without considering how the lettering is going to be integrated into it.
Oh, I'd die on that
and
hill.
have it actually be comics.
Yeah. No, I would murder on that hill, frankly. Yeah. What's the process? Just because I've never asked this question before. What's the process when you're doing white letters on black?
Oh yeah. Well,
is that more challenging? I mean, just
no.
Okay.
It used to be in my self-published stuff. Wait, was somebody still here? We were talking about gel pens and why? Okay, so we were talking about how the tools, like even just the commercially available like gel pens, opaque white ink, whiteout pens, the chemical properties of these products have changed over like 15 or 20 years. So when I was self-publishing stuff in 2001 even, I was able to find a gel pen and just write straight on the black ink. And then it was back in the days of photostatting, where they'd actually shoot an acetate or whatever of the page, and it would be just a crisp, beautiful white. That kind of ink like the brand exists, but the chemical properties changed and it just stopped looking good. So now what's easier for me to do is I pencil, like, I guess maybe I did this a little bit in Swallow Me Whole, and then I realized this is what I needed to do. If there's a section where it's a white lettering on black, you pencil it in, and then I'll letter it normally, positive, black ink on the white area. Then I'll erase it. Before I ink the page, I then scan the whole page, like 1200 DPI. I convert it to bitmap, I make it negative, and I just save it for later. And then I just ink over the whole thing and erase the lettering, basically. And then that's the only part that I actually manipulate in Photoshop, is just dropping in the negative lettering.
Interesting. I'm glad I answered that question. I would never have heard that if I hadn't thought about that. All right, so I know you're doing Run, or you're participating in. You're a with.
I am. Yeah. So I drew the first 10 pages of Run Book 1. Basically, it's a bridge sequence that functions on 2 levels. So the talented Afua Richardson, truly a Renaissance woman of many skills and strengths, is doing a fantastic job drawing Run. She's also, in the same way that I had to crystallize a new style for March, she has worked out a new style for herself. And so Andrew's idea, once Run started really happening, was for me to do the first scene so that aesthetically we as readers could bridge March and Run and see them in a kind of digestible continuity. But also, the scene that I drew in Run takes place 2 days after the signing of the Voting Rights Act, which is basically the end of March Book 3. So August, I think 6th, 1965, John Lewis is up in the White House. He's up in the Capitol. He's getting pens from LBJ, contributing to one of the greatest steps forward in our grand society. The next day, he flies back to a small town in Georgia, and the next morning, August 8th, he's with 12 random activists and protesters back doing the work on the streets trying to desegregate one church in Americus, Georgia. So we wanted to kind of iron in that, it's not a clean and final victory. The work is constant. The work continues. And so for folks who are, paying attention to the chronology, recognizing that that's 2 days later, he's back in the streets, getting arrested, going to jail. But then also the second half of the scene is across town simultaneously in Americus, Georgia. There's a massive white supremacist gathering that's between 300 and 700 people, and it's led by this Grand Wizard. But it's important and also relevant to today because we illustrate in this scene how the white supremacist extreme right has been paying attention to the strategies and tactics of the civil rights movement, and they're co-opting and adopting them. So the whole thing is this Grand Wizard, and he has all of his shitty white supremacists assembled, and he's telling them basically the SNCC do's and don'ts that we established in March Book 1. And he's like, okay, you guys need to, keep it together, that you will not strike back if you're hit. If people yell at you, spit at you, you're gonna keep your head forward. If you can't handle that, then you do not march with us. And then they're just like, all right, assholes, let's go on a march through town. But even physically, the discipline of their marches are co-opted from the success of the civil rights movement, and recognizing the ways in which, at first the Tea Party movement, but then developing into the extreme overt white supremacist right, have been adopting the tactics, starting really with the anti-globalist and anti-war left at the beginning of the millennium, but in being able to use those and objectively speaking, possibly improve upon them in the most awful ways in terms of being able to use technology to their advantage. Like the Echoes, I hated drawing that scene just because it was too relevant to 2017 or 2018 when I was drawing it, and I was like, I don't want to do this. And now I have all these pages of assholes marching through the street, and I don't know what to do with them.
Right.
Like, I'm just like, I'm never gonna sell these. I don't want to see who buys them. You know, like, I'm not gonna give them to anybody. So I just like put them in my closet. I'm like, well, see you later, assholes.
What else do you have coming up other than this?
The other backed up book from March time was a book, Two Dead, written by Van Jensen. It takes place in Little Rock. It's fiction, but it's based on some real weird stuff that really happened. It's like a supernatural detective story, but it's really about PTSD and trauma and mid-century America not talking about the trauma of war and segregation at any price immediately after World War II. I'm also working on a book called Tornado Children that does not have a home yet. It's a shorter comics memoir about raising kids in an era of necessary protest. And then I have like this little comics essay I'm doing about new style, like consumer level style and aesthetic choices that are indicating the mainstreaming of fascism. And it has to do with like, you know, stylistic choices with like Punisher skulls and removing color from the American flag, the allowances for facial hair in the military, stylistic choices with like color choices and rim choices for pickup trucks and SUVs. Anyway, this is like the thing I'm obsessed with, but I think I'm onto something. I just need to sit down and finish it. But anyway.
So do we have dates on any of these? Or
Nope.
everything's still part of the future? Okay.
Like everything's just a mad dash right now. Like I'm trying to drop everything and just do Two Dead, but at the same time, I'm like, well, like these other books that are more worldly, like the world. This is a really weird time to be drawing comics that have worldly relevance, because it's like I can't finish Tornado Children or that weird Styles of Fascism essay. I can't finish them fast enough. Like if it's just a 100-page comic for Tornado Children, it's like if that takes me 6 months to do, we don't even know what the world will look like in 6 months.
Sure don't.
It's just like it's a weird position to be in when you're trying to like comment on the world in real time. But like the real time is a little too real.
Yeah. Bit too real, yeah.
Yep.
Sounds like a Python bit.
Bit too real.
Yeah. All right, well, so our book was Come Again. I want to thank you for this. I seriously, I think it's a terrific book. If you're watching at home, maybe even years later, who knows, go out and buy a copy of this. This is a terrific book. Everybody here loved it. I'm seeing enthusiastic faces everywhere, so that's really good. Thank you, Nate, for coming out and talking to the club, and thank you. I have some quick notes for the rest. On Sunday, it's Kids Club. I know none of you are going to come to Kids Club, but I still got to mention our Kids Club book is Cotton's Secrets of the Wind. This is a good book. The pull quote on the cover is a Jeff Smith quote. It says, "Like the wind in the willows and Animal Farm together in one gorgeous graphic novel," which I really think describes this book in a really fantastic way. So even though it's a kids-aimed book, I actually really recommend it to all of you adults. On Sunday, we've got Jim Pascoe, who's the writer, who's going to be here. We have a public signing with him at 11, and Heidi Arnold, the artist, is going to join us on video. And then next month's book, I don't have copies to give to you guys yet, but we have Lisa Hannawalt coming for Coyote Dog Girl.
It's a great book. I read it.
It's a great book, and she's a great creator, and I'm really excited about this conversation, and I think you guys are all going to be, it's going to be a good conversation. So Lisa's here on September 29th. So put that on your calendars now. And other than that, one more round of applause, please, for Nate Powell for coming again. Thank you guys for coming out. Thank you for coming out. Thank Jordan for doing our tech. Thank Julie and Doug for keeping the store together. And we'll see you guys next month. Take care. Success. And we're out. Very good. So if any of you still need your books signed, I suspect he'd be okay with doing that.
So if anybody has any other questions or wants to talk about anything,
Yeah, sure.
right here.
Exactly. So if you guys wouldn't mind